record on this computer. Okay, good. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Nashville Microsoft Azure User Group meeting. This is our logo. That's our website, as you probably know, since you registered for this meeting. And we're recording this session on our YouTube channel. So if you don't attend, obviously if you're here, you're attending, but for meetings that you don't attend, we always post the meetings afterwards. So this is a little bit for those of you who are new, and I do see a few names that I haven't seen before. For those of you who are new, we're all about Microsoft Azure at all levels, and really development, infrastructure, management. We kind of mix it. We try to mix it up a bit, but we focus on everything related to Azure. And unfortunately, we don't meet in person anymore for the time being, because of the pandemic. We used to meet every third Thursday at 6 o'clock here in Nashville at Microsoft. We still meet the same time in the same third Thursday, but we don't meet in person. We may go back to in-person meetings in the next couple of months. We're still kicking that idea around, trying to decide whether it's too early or whether it's time to open up, as they say, okay? We have over 1,800 registered members, which still blows my mind for a city the size of Nashville. So we have a good sized group. We're growing. Tell your friends about us. We could always use more members. And for those of you who do attend, I always ask that you suggest topics for future meetings. I don't ask through email to the whole group because, frankly, I want to take care of the people that actually show up for meetings, all right? So if you have a suggestion for a topic for a future meeting, let us know. Got a board of directors. I'm the original founder and the president of the group. I always joke about being the group's benevolent dictator, since we've never had an election, but that's my unofficial title. By day, I'm a Azure Solutions Architect with CTG, big international consulting firm. Roger Dolman is a co-founder. He was here at the beginning, and he's a co-founder and vice president of the group. And by day, he's an enterprise architect at Deloitte here in Nashville. Tim Warner, who is actually also our presenter tonight, he's an Azure Group member, board member, and he's a Microsoft MVP and prolific plural site course and book author. And that's his link to his website down there. Okay. Okela Allred is our director of academic outreach. She works with the local colleges and trade schools, getting folks that are interested in Azure to come to our meetings. Matthew Puckett from Microsoft is he's a principal national cloud solutions architect these days. He was with the group from the beginning, sponsoring our group and helping us to get meeting space at Microsoft, and he still works in that capacity. And Jack Hagler from Vaco has been our refreshment group our refreshment sponsor since 2013 when we started the group. So those are all the folks that are members of the board. I want to thank our sponsors again, Microsoft for space when we can do it. And also for paying our meetup dues. As I mentioned earlier before we started the recording, we're a member of a Microsoft User Group Association that pays for our dues, which is nice because up until last year, I used to have to pay for them out of my own pocket. So I really appreciate that. Again, Vaco's our permanent refreshment sponsor. Vaco also is providing us with our Zoom subscription that we're using. Computer Task Group is my company, and they graciously let me have some time in my daily schedule to work on the group. So I wanted to give them a shout out. And the Greater Nashville Technology Council. In addition to my role as president of the Azure Group, I'm also the chairman of a group of the Technology Group Leadership Council within Nashville Technology Council. That's a group that's working to support all the Azure groups and all the non-Azure groups in the area that are working in technology. And there's about 50 groups here in the Nashville area, and one kind of technology or another. And, I'm chairman of that, the leadership committee. If your company's interested in sponsoring a future meeting, get in touch with Roger Dahlman. That's his email address down at the bottom, and we'll see what we can work out. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to our presenter tonight, Tim Warner. As I said, Tim is a Microsoft Azure MVP. He's a prolific Pluralsight course and book author, and he's always available on Twitter, right, Tim? So
that's correct.
So I'll just turn the floor over to you.
Okay. Let me see here. I want desktop.
I'll stop sharing and see if you can share, or if I've messed it up.
Zoom says that I'm screen sharing.
Yes, I
you
see
see
it.
my slide deck?
I do. I see your slide deck. Yep.
All right. Well, let's do this thing. Thanks for having me back to the group, Bill. Thanks for being here, everybody. This is Get On Board Azure Monitoring with Log Analytics and KQL. Learning objectives I figure I'll go on for about an hour. And by the way, anytime you have a question, please interrupt me right in my tracks, would you? Rather than just hold off until the end. If you have an idea or something to share or a question, definitely bring it to the table sooner rather than later. We'll start by looking at foundational concepts briefly, making sure we understand terminology, because it can be a little bit confusing at first for sure. We'll then do some demos in terms of deploying a log analytics workspace, installing management solutions, that kind of stuff, connecting to data sources, and then the other half of this is using the Kusto query language to extract meaningful data or insights from your logs. Session materials you can find on my GitHub. Bill, I don't know, I'm getting these admit things and it's kind of messing up my presentation here. I don't know if you can strip me of the ability to see the admit control, but still be a presenter. If not, that's fine. I just want to mention that. Let me hide these controls. The session materials are at timw.info/KQL2021. And that's just a PDF version of the slide deck. Unfortunately, I learned a couple things just in the last hour that I didn't have time to put in the slide deck. So I'll just present those to you live, and if you want to make a quick note, it's just a couple websites that I think you might find particularly impactful. Okay, so as far as initial preliminary concepts and vocabulary, here's an annotated diagram that you might already be familiar with from Microsoft Docs that shows Azure Monitor architecture. Let me see if I can get my drawing tools going here. I'm on my home computer, which is a Mac, so I'm RDPing into my teaching server, but sometimes, okay, it looks like we've got it. So here are the ideas that you've got all of your data sources that are kicking out some kind of telemetry data or remote measurement data. And what's neat about Azure Monitor and Log Analytics specifically is that it's built for hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. So you would expect, I think, that we can extract metrics, which is time series numeric data, like, think of CPU counters being ticked off every second, as well as persisted log data. And there can be an overlap where you store metrics and logs, vice versa, but metrics and logs are fundamentally the two types of data that we're looking at here in Azure Monitor. And as I said, you can point your VMs into Azure Monitor and all your Azure infrastructure. But if you don't know, you will know soon enough that you can onboard your physical and virtual machines in your local data centers, as well as VMs in other clouds like Google and AWS. So this notion of one monitoring platform to rule them all kind of comes in here. I also give a shout out, although I don't go into it in depth in this session, that if you have line of business apps that you all have developed internally and your developers have created log streams for those applications, you can absolutely send those custom data sources into your log analytics workspace and query it right alongside everything else. So I guess I should have backed up. What is the problem that we're looking to solve here? Well, especially in a public cloud like Azure, you and I both know we're never going to get within any distance of a data center. And so because of that, we're never going to get near the hardware or have any kind of hands-on. So any kind of telemetry or remote measurement we can get from our infrastructure seems to me to be a good thing. And then layering it on top of that multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, Pretty compelling. Then you see on the right side of the diagram, these are just some of the various outputs of your investigation. So we've got really 3 phases going on. There's setting up our Log Analytics workspace and optionally adding on solutions, which you'll learn about shortly. There's onboarding your data sources so that you have something in the Log Analytics data warehouse. And then there's making use of the Kusto query language as well as the other tools that are in Azure Monitor itself. There's application insights. There's a whole bunch of different Azure products that tap into Log Analytics. So what's this saying? The little bit of history. You probably know that Microsoft eats its own dog food and really always has. So they use their own products. And Microsoft, for some number of years, had this internal big data analytics platform called Data Explorer, where they could ingest log data internally for internal use, and they'd have a compute cluster to do massive parallel computing under the hood. And they're able to, through this query language they developed that they called Kusto. And why is it called Kusto? A little bit of trivia. It comes from the late great French oceanographer and explorer Jacques Cousteau, and there's a play on the word there. Kusto query language is Kusto. It's more phonetic, but it's based on the exploration idea of Jacques Cousteau. So anyway, Microsoft, I guess, got a good idea a few years ago. Well, we've gotten so much mileage out of this Data Explorer platform with this KQL language that resembles SQL, structured query language. It resembles the Splunk control language. I mean, it was designed to be immediately graspable by many different types of people, infrastructure people, database folks, data folks, etc. Why not turn this loose to the public? Okay, so think of that. That's stream 1. Stream 2 in the background is this collection of cloud-based solutions that used to be called Operations Management Suite, or OMS. And initially, I've defined this as kind of the system center products, but in the cloud. You know, you've got Config Manager and Operations Manager and Windows Server Update Service and these sort of things that historically were local only. We've got analogous products that were originally part of this OMS, and Microsoft has certainly been working hard over the last few years to migrate the OMS tools natively into Azure, and they've gone quite a nice distance with that. You still will see references to OMS in the portal from now on or in the API. There just must be such deeply hard-coded references, they'll probably never go away. But now, what we now call management solutions in Azure were originally, by and large, part of this separate set of tools called Operations Management Suite. Okay. And lastly, a little bit more about the Kusto query language architecture. As I mentioned, it was designed to be a single, relatively user-friendly data exploration language that does a lot of the same things that you can do, for example, with SQL select queries, Splunk, like I said, elements of Bash shell scripting, elements of JavaScript in there. It's really kind of a granola of sorts of different technologies patched together. And what we've got here on this slide from left to right are all of your data sources. Now, what is so cool to me about this is that you've got different data sources in or out of Azure that are producing log data. Think of all the different data types that are being emitted. You probably got a whole lot of CSV. You might just have a lot of key value storage and from an Azure storage account, or you might have JSON or XML. I mean, it doesn't matter. What's cool about this is when you send your log data into your Log Analytics workspace, Log Analytics creates these virtual table constructs, and you can then use KQL to write queries against one or more of those tables. You've even got the concept of the join syntax to where you can aggregate data across multiple tables. I just think that's the coolest darn thing. So it doesn't matter what your original data format is as such. And even like I said earlier, if you have custom log data, there's a great docs article. If you do a search for Azure Log Analytics custom logs, you'll get a nice step-by-step on how you can prepare your custom application logs to become a virtual table in Log Analytics. All right, questions, comments so far? I know this is just preliminary stuff. All right, we'll get more into the language later. Okay, well, what I do want to draw on this slide is on the left-hand side. In Azure, you're going to see that it's trivial to onboard your Azure virtual machines, both Linux and Windows. We've got an agent, as you would expect, the Log Analytics agent, and it itself has gone through so many name changes over the last several years. Can hardly count how many, but now it seems it's called the Log Analytics agent. And this is what you would install manually or in an automated way outside of Azure as a way to configure those remote machines. The agent does a lot of heavy lifting. And it's good to know that the Log Analytics agent is firewall friendly, so you don't have any dependency on a site-to-site virtual private network or an express route circuit. You could go directly over the internet. So with that, let's do a demo here. I think what we'll do is deploy a workspace and show some other spots where KQL and Log Analytics rears its head in our subscriptions. Yeah, so I'll use that as my jumping off point. Let me head on over to the portal, and if we do a search for Log Analytics workspaces, that's going to be step one. And I've got a couple already. I'm going to create a third one. How many of these does your company need would be a question. Well, it depends on how big the company is and so forth. The idea is that your Log Analytics workspace, I look at it as a sort of big data, almost like Synapse Analytics SQL pool. It's almost like, or it's the Spark pool, a big data analytics platform with a fully managed compute cluster that auto scales. All of that scaling and infrastructure is totally hidden from you though. And you can send seemingly infinite amounts of data as an ingest. You get charged for both your data ingested per period and also for the retention period. So I'm going to put this in my Nashville resource group, and I'll just call it Nashville LA test. And my region is East US. Now, note that you do not have to have a separate Log Analytics workspace for each region that you're in. I mean, maybe I've never heard anybody have latency issues cross region, but there's not a dependency. You can bring in VMs from multiple subscriptions as long as they are in the same Azure AD tenant, and they can be in any region. It doesn't have to match like, you know, with a virtual network, it does. Pricing, I'm glad we don't have to go down this route. Check out, I have a friend on Twitter named Wes Miller, and he works for a company that does licensing as a service. So I would contact Wes if you have any questions. That's what I do. Basically, I describe it like this. You've got free, and notice that it's called a legacy tier. I don't know what that means, if that's going to go the way of the dodo and there's not going to be free. And it's confusing because if you go to the public page at azure.com and look up Azure Monitor pricing, they say you get 30 days of retention for free, but here it says that if we choose the free pricing tier, we only get 7 days of retention. And I don't see it anywhere here, but you're also capped at the free tier to something like 3 or 5 gigs as your maximum corpus of data in your analytics workspace. I'm going to just do pay as you go. And that's it. So as you can see, creating the workspace is pretty trivial. In my experience, the case where you as a business may definitely want to have more than one workspace is if you and your team, your security team particularly, wants to use Azure Sentinel. Are you familiar with Azure Sentinel? It's the SIEM-SOAR or SIM-SOAR. I always forget how to pronounce that. The Security Information Event Management Platform. It rides on top of a Log Analytics workspace. And so the first step here in deploying an Azure Sentinel service, as you'll see, as soon as we click Add, we're immediately prompted, add Sentinel to which workspace? And I would advise against putting Sentinel on top of your infrastructure workplace for 2 reasons. One, because of the sensitivity of the data, and you'll probably want data partitioning. And number 2, you'll find that Sentinel tattoos the workspace such that the interface is vastly different from the traditional Log Analytics workspace. And that should make sense to you, I think, because Sentinel is all about security management, and the traditional Log Analytics workspace is about basically infrastructure management. So if I wanted to continue, I could select the workspace and go on from there, but I won't. What are some other places where this rears its head? You familiar with Application Insights? This is our main application performance management or app-specific monitoring platform. And sure enough, if you're looking to do queries into that data. If we come down to logs, which is where you can get to the Azure portal's built-in KQL client, sure enough, this is all specific virtual table and log data, metric data too, specific to this instance of application insights. Okay. What is something else where this KQL and this idea comes to the forefront? Well, when you go to the all resources view, this interface and this engine, this ability to quickly inventory your environment, is part of a technology called Resource Graph, Azure Resource Graph. And notice here that we can open a query and we can get into this Azure Resource Graph Explorer. So again, this is KQL. This is a subset of the full Kusto query language, but it's still the same basic language. So I think, are you seeing a theme here? This is why I always tell my students when I'm teaching, whether it's certification related or not, when it comes to monitoring, it's really inescapable to get on board with, that's why I named this session, get on board with KQL and Azure Log Analytics, because it's really the way that we're going here. Okay. Let me see. As a matter of fact, let me give a shout out to a friend of mine, a fellow Microsoft MVP named Billy York. This is one of the resources that I was made aware of just in the last hour. I wanted to make sure you had it. It's not in the slide deck, so if you just want to make a note, Billy's website is cloudsma.com. SMA stands for Systems Management Automation, cloudsma.com. And as you can see, he's got this fantastic aggregation. See, Billy is a KQL maestro. He would forget more about KQL than I probably would ever know. He's absolutely my go-to person for this. And he's on Twitter, SC Automation, and you've got the link up here. So he's another person you should definitely know. And as you see, see if I forgot anything, that Kusto is also found, besides being an Azure Monitor and Sentinel, it's an App Insights Security Center, Data Explorer itself, the Resource Graph, Microsoft 365 ATP, and honestly, I don't know what CM Pivot is. Got to figure that out. But then he goes in and gives a whole bunch of really good tutorial and docs and resources links. Speaking of which, let me just mention that while I saw it on the article here. You can actually, just for Kusto-based big data analytics, you can create your own Data Explorer clusters here in Azure, and that would host the massively parallel compute layer for you. And you can connect to it. You create your cluster, you create what's called a database. Then you can ingest mass amounts of structured, unstructured, or semi-structured data and use that Kusto query language across it all. So I like Data Explorer as a kind of a more modular or flexible kind of log analytics. Hope I'm not confusing you with all these options. Lastly, you should be aware of the Kusto Explorer graphical application. I don't know if this is called Kusto.Explorer or Kusto Explorer. I'll just call it Kusto Explorer. But I remember seeing this at an MVP summit a number of years ago, and at the time it was internal only, and here it is now in the public domain. And let me show you a screenshot. It doesn't have the best interface. It reminds me of Office 2007 in some ways. But what you're looking at here is, I think it's just Windows. It's a Win32 app, but it's a desktop app that allows you to connect to your Data Explorer instance in Azure, and you can do big data analytics from your desktop. And Billy told me just in the last hour that you can do KQL against your Azure resources as well. So that I wanted to, just in the name of being as well-rounded of an instructor as possible, I wanted to surface that. And this article in the Microsoft Docs is called Kusto Explorer Installation and User Interface. All right. Now let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming here. You've got a workspace. You know that your goal is deeper visibility into your Azure subscription resources and perhaps beyond. Perhaps you want to bring in your infrastructure servers from your local environment as well. In the workspace settings here, there's a couple spots that we'll want to start with. First, we'll want to come down to workspace data sources and see how we can immediately tap into our local system center environment. If we've been historically keeping logs and storage accounts, for example, you know how historically with Azure VMs, you have the guest OS diagnostics, where in Windows, you're pulling your event logs and performance counters, and Linux, you're doing syslog and this sort of thing. You may have months or years of that data already archived in storage accounts. This allows you to surface that intelligence and transparently get to it within the Log Analytics workspace. The Azure Activity Log, as you hopefully know, is a great audit log that's per subscription. And this used to be a separate solution that you had to purchase called Activity Log Analytics. But now you can onboard all your subscriptions and write KQL to look across the activity log of all of those subscriptions. Why is that useful? Well, I think if nothing else, the activity log is a great source of truth because it's going to reveal every control plane operation that Azure does internally and your users do. So to find out who was it that rebooted the VM last week that's not copping to it, the activity log is not going to hide that information for sure. The virtual machines, like I said, this is going to touch all the VMs that it sees, not just within the same region as the workspace, but in your whole tenant. So you can go across subscriptions, resource groups, and regions. And as you can see, I've selected each one and clicked connect, and Azure just is happy to deploy the Log Analytics agent automatically. Now, what if you did have a second Log Analytics workspace? Could you take this Win1 VM, for example? It seems like it's just one-to-one, doesn't it? Where we'd have to disconnect it from Log Analytics Workspace 1 and then connect it to 2. Not so fast. There's a docs article. If you look up Microsoft Azure Log Analytics Agent docs or something like that, there's a great intro article to describe the Log Analytics agent. And there's a bit on that article where it talks about multi-homing, where you can, in fact, have a virtual machine reporting its telemetry, its log data, and its metric data to more than one workspace, if you so wish, for example. Maybe to your infrastructure workspace and your Sentinel workspace, for example. And this works the same with Linux or Windows. Now, for machines that are in other clouds or in your local environment, we can come up the settings to, I think it's agent management, yeah. And what you'll do is grab the Log Analytics agent for your operating system and processor architecture. It's just an MSI for Windows. For Linux, let me see, what are they offering here? I don't know what package format it is offhand, etc. You could always consult the docs, you know that deal. But bottom line is, when you run the software on the machine, you're going to need to provide the workspace ID of your Log Analytics workspace and then either the primary or secondary API key. And the same rules apply as they normally would about any API key. You may want to include in your security hygiene periodically regenerating these because, you know, if somebody has your workspace ID in one of your keys, there's nothing to prevent them from joining your environment. All right, let me see. If you go to advanced settings, this brings up just, well, it's an old school screen, doesn't it? This was not where I wanted to go. This was another place where you would go to fine tune the specific data that you want to collect from your data sources. But notice now it's saying that that information has moved elsewhere to agents management. So yeah, if I go back up again, this time to agents management, you can, no, I'm sorry, agents configuration. This is where you can figure out what degree of logging, log capture, and verbosity you want. As you can see, there's Windows event logs, Windows performance counters, Linux performance counters, syslog, and IIS. And that's going to determine what gets captured on all your agents. I wish that was a little bit more granular, but notice that there's a section on custom logs. You can create what are called scope configurations, because I mean, look at it. You might have a giant environment in Azure that goes across subscriptions, plus other clouds, plus maybe on-premises. So you can logically group these agents into computer groups, and you can create what are called scoping levels, I think they're called, where you can cut your queries down so where you're not going across so much data at once. I mean, again, the idea, one of the selling points here is that this is big data analytics to where you can interactively query. You shouldn't have to send a query in and then go out for lunch and then you come back and you're still waiting there wondering if it's finished. It's meant to be fast enough to where it's while you wait kind of thing. This making some semblance of sense thus far? Questions, comments, concerns, curiosities at this point?
I have a question about the agent configuration.
Uh-huh.
Is that being deployed when you make agent configuration changes here? Are you pushing changes to the actual agents running on the virtual machines themselves, or are you just filtering it within the workspace and kind of throwing away extra data that's coming in?
My understanding is that this is informing how the log agent behaves on the system. Yeah. So if you don't choose anything for Windows event logs, you're going to go to the log search and not see any event log data. So you have to make sure that you've brought in. And originally, there was nothing here. I added these in here. So you can add Windows event log and go through the whole list of available ones here. Yeah. So if anybody knows any differently, let me know. But this is the canonical, my understanding of how you specify what you want to collect from those agents.
So if you were to change it after doing agent deployment, is it then pushing that configuration
Yes.
out to the agents?
Right. Yes. There's a heartbeat system that's happening between your connected agents and Azure. I don't know how often those heartbeat messages are happening, but there absolutely is bidirectional traffic happening between client and server. I don't know the specific numbers offhand, but yes. So a change here, if I decide that I don't want information for these, I just want warning, I can make a change. You could pop open network, what's the Wireshark, and see what's happening at that level. That's actually would be a good experiment. Now, reason why this can be a bit confusing, especially with virtual machines, is if we go over to virtual machines, for example, let's pick on Win1. I just showed you how within the Log Analytics workspace, you can just click a mouse and you're connected. And we can verify that because if we look at the virtual machine extension, we'll see the Microsoft monitoring agent. Remember I said that the Log Analytics agent's gone through untold name changes? Well, the MMA is what it was before Log Analytics agent. So yes, that's true, but you'll also notice that on the VM we can come down and we can still do the, is it still here? The guest OS diagnostics. What is it called nowadays? Not boot diagnostics. Is it performance? No? Is it diagnostic settings? Yeah, here it is. Right. So at the VM, if you go to diagnostic settings, this is what we used to have before Log Analytics. And I actually asked the engineering team at Microsoft about this. I thought there's nothing stopping an administrator from having guest level monitoring turned on, which uses its own agent, by the way, which presumably is going to have a CPU and RAM implication, and also onboarding that virtual machine to Log Analytics. And I had a hard time. It was like getting, you know, that metaphor of trying to nail Jell-O to the wall to get a straight answer. But the straightest response I got is they eventually admitted that yes, there is some overlap, that although you can, you know, and do both this guest level, which logs to a storage account, and the Log Analytics agent, which logs to your Log Analytics, although there is some conflict, they didn't use conflict, but kind of overlap of functionality in terms of data that's being collected. Their justification for that being allowable or okay, not a red flag necessarily, was number one, they say that it's minimal impact on the performance of the server. And they also made kind of an argument that I don't understand fully, but I'm just going to pass it along to you. They mentioned that you get better results in Azure Monitor. I guess that kind of makes sense because, for example, in Azure Monitor, we can use the Metrics Explorer here to bring up live numeric time series data. We would choose whatever our scope in question is, whatever resource type. I don't know if I have any VMs in there. I hope so. Let's try. Yeah, so the metrics that come in here, if you read the docs, the Azure docs say that Azure will always collect baseline metrics from every resource, whether you enable them or not. But when you enable diagnostic settings, that expands the scope of what you can plot in here. And so take that for what it's worth. I'm afraid I don't think I added too much more clarity on that, but you've got the guest OS. You might just want to just keep it simple and turn off the guest OS diagnostics and just use Log Analytics. Maybe you don't use this Metrics Explorer very much in here anyway. I don't know. While we're here in Azure Monitor, there's an important stop along our journey, and that's down at the bottom under Settings, Diagnostic Settings. Because presumably you want to monitor more than just the VM object itself. If the VM, heaven forbid, has a public IP address, you might want to gather data on it. Of course, there's TCP/IP statistics, network security group. There's lots of goodies in here. And the good news is that this should be a one-time operation pretty much. You notice that my diagnostics is disabled for these. Let's choose this network interface. I'm going to copy the resource name to my clipboard. You don't have to do that. And notice that we can create more than one diagnostic setting. This is to give you flexibility to send different logs or different metrics to different targets if you need to. So I'm going to call this diag setting the name of the network interface, and I'll put diag. You'll find that some resources surface just time series metric data like this one. Others surface both logs and metrics, and others do just logs. And notice that you can do storage account, which is kind of old school. Who wants to go and looking in a storage account? It's not a scalable solution, but for archival purposes, perhaps so. An event hub, why would we want to do that? Well, this would be if you want to take action, possibly, on the telemetry that's coming out of the resource into the event hub. And then we have our Log Analytics workspace. Let me make sure to choose the one that I'm actually using, my TIM workspace, and hit save. Now, ideally, I would advise having your diagnostic settings in your deployment template so that it's configured right out of the box. Let me step back here. It's hard to get back to the original view. It's kind of annoying. And I'll select this NSG. I wanted to get an example of one that has logs and metrics. This one just has logs. See, so this is just bringing out that point that it's going to be resource dependent, the specific kind of info you can get. And you can also note, take to the bank, that when we send this data into our Log Analytics workspace, we will find virtual tables that each have their own column set, quote unquote. You know, basically if it's a CSV, each header, column header, is going to be a virtual column in your Log Analytics workspace that you'll be able to write to. And that's a good case for consulting the docs. I don't know how many times I've done a search for something like this, Network Security Group Rule Counter, Azure Diagnostics, to try to map what's going on. I'll call this NSG diag and click save. All right, let's go back to the slide deck and see what else we've got going on. Okay, what about management solutions? What's the situation? Well, you know, nowadays it's hard to find an application that's not extensible in some way or another. And personally, I think that's great. You know, whether it's a web browser or Visual Studio Code or whatever. Same thing with Log Analytics. Because of this Operations Management Suite or OMS that already did have a collection of solutions like anti-malware assessment, SQL Server performance or analytics, you know, different tools, update management. Now these are surfaced in our subscription as management solutions. And we can see those directly in Azure Monitor, as you can see here in the middle left part of the interface. In Azure Monitor, when you go to Insights and you select one of those workloads, you'll be given just one-click access to install appropriate solutions. And I need you to think of two ramifications of that. If you want to go in and turn on the VM Insights, it's going to require you to have a, wait for it, a Log Analytics workspace, if you don't already have one. And two, you need to think of the cost implications of enabling a separate solution. So that would be a case of looking in the pricing pages just to get a check on that. So let's take a look at that. I've got a really handy link. I'm not sure if this made the slide deck that I shared. I think what I'll do, if you follow my Twitter, Tech Trainer Tim, I will follow up tomorrow morning with some of these links, and I'll just share them out one by one on my Twitter feed. But there, it can be, in my opinion, just whatever, take it for what it's worth, difficult to enumerate which management solutions are actually available, you know. So let me dial up that page on my other monitor, timw.info/solutions. Let me get the URL. It takes you out to the online Azure Marketplace, and that link that's on this slide here will turn into a view filter so that we can see only the management solutions, just to give you an idea of how you can extend the breadth and depth of your monitoring is what I'm saying. And I would suggest that we change the publisher to Microsoft as well. Okay, All right, so service map, there's an example of a management solution that does dependency mapping, where you can call up a virtual machine, let's say, and see exactly who's connected to it client-wise, who it's connecting to server-wise, what ports and protocols and services are in use. Really useful for a migration scenario. Now, what used to be called Network Performance Monitor now has another name. It's called Azure Monitor for Networks or something like that. But the bottom line there is that you're able to surface telemetry on your Azure virtual networks and even your on-premises subnets, so that you can actually generate things like latency values, availability values for your subnets, that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to read them all, but as you can see here, there's update management, which is like Windows Server Update Service, but it runs in the cloud. Container monitoring for containers. For centralized management of the, what's it called nowadays? The Microsoft anti-malware agent. It'll grab that. And it can also manage the System Center Configuration Manager anti-malware agent as well. So the idea here is that you can onboard these solutions. For example, if you want to directly in the portal, I mean, you can go through the Azure Marketplace, as you see here. Let's say we wanted to bring in the anti-malware assessment. We can just create an instance of it. And what we'll find is when you bring in one of these solutions, there may be some additional configuration to get it fully on board. I know that's the case with Network Performance Monitor. You need to actually browse to which virtual networks and subnets you want to monitor. And each one will have a collection of these tiles, as you can see on the small screenshot, to give you kind of a dashboard view. That's something else we're not going to get into in this session. But you can work in Log Analytics to create visualizations, kind of, dashboard views. And with KQL, which we will get into, you can export that data into Power BI to include in your Power BI reports. So you just bring these guys in, and every one of these solutions will force you to choose your Log Analytics workspace. If I go back to Azure Monitor, like I mentioned, in Azure Monitor more recently over the last couple years, Microsoft has created these insights, which really do a couple things. One, it's an easy way to funnel people into Log Analytics and to using solutions. But number two, once you're in there, you'll find a lot of integration with some other tools that Microsoft has created to help us with our monitoring. For example, many of these insights tap into workbooks. Are you familiar with workbooks at all? The idea with a workbook, it's an interactive, workbook. But it's got stuff already in there. In other words, there's a whole library of workbooks for different workloads, app services, containers, virtual machines, databases, and they include different views. Now, you can use Kusto query language to inform these views. You can either use a metrics explorer interface or you can write a KQL query to do it. But these workbooks, especially the built-in ones, are meant to help businesses who are like, well, what are the most important? I know how to get the data going, the telemetry data going, but how can I, at a glance, quickly see the health of my servers, for example? So as you can see, this is a built-in workbook called Virtual Machine Performance, and we can see in this kind of visualization right off the bat what's happening with it. So I just wanted to mention that just kind of as a drive-by. I think it's more than time for us to get into KQL itself. So there's many places where you can get to the log search interface. As you can see, you can get to it right from Azure Monitor. And when you choose Azure Monitor for the first time, it asks you what your scope is. Where do you want to stop? Do you want to look at everything? Do you just want to look at a subscription? Do you want to look at a resource group? If you're at the resource level, that can be a bit easier. For example, if we want to look at my TIM VM1, we can go to the log search pane there, or I can just find it by searching for it. There we go. And this will give us a list of tables and stuff that are just specific to the virtual machine. So it really depends upon what your preferred starting point is. This is the in-browser KQL client. If you're looking for one outside of Azure, the only one I have for you is that Kusto Explorer that I told you about at the beginning of the session. Personally, I think it's kind of crazy that Microsoft has the data, I think it's called Data Studio. Are you familiar with that? It's the sister application or sibling application to Visual Studio Code. And why it doesn't have built-in KQL, I have no idea at all, but whatever. So here we are in the KQL client here, and just to get you some initial familiarity, what you've got going on, I think I'd rather look at this more globally. So let's go to the workspace where I've got everything. And let me go to logs in there. Here we go. As I mentioned, as data comes in from your various data sources, Log Analytics creates these virtual tables. And notice that you can choose these by different grouping levels, category, resource type, and I like solution because it shows the solutions that I've enabled in this subscription. Anti-malware assessment, for example. And evidently, the anti-malware assessment has just one virtual table called protection status. Again, this is coming from the underlying logs. And notice that when you hover over one of these, you get a brief description of what it is, and you can look. This is really nice. Make sure to look at that useful links. Right there, boom, take you right to the docs. I love the docs. Don't get me started. Or we can see preview data. What's this showing? Use in editor. Yes, I want to bring it over here. I'm not sure I'm going to get any data. Oh, I do get some data back. Okay. Well, the way that the query format works, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. No, I don't want magnifier. I just want to zoom in. Come on, Mac. Don't let me down. Try one more thing. There we go. Okay, that's a little bit better. So the idea is you've got all of your data tables here, and your queries always start with one of those virtual table names. In this case, we're looking evidently at the protection status table that's part of the anti-malware assessment solution. You don't need to put a hard return in like I did, but that's normally the general practice. And you separate your table and your clauses with a pipe. And one nice thing about the KQL editor here in the portal is that IntelliSense is pretty fast. It doesn't stutter like VS Code does. And so you can add some keywords that might be immediately familiar to you. For example, where to do row level filtering. And you'll also notice that you get drop downs of not just the keywords, but also the values as well, you see. So where, and then we can bring out, we can do where OS name, for example. I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this. And we've got all sorts of different operators. KQL is case insensitive by default. I'm not sure what I would provide for this. Guess I could look down here in the sample results. But the idea is that you can keep adding on and iteratively change these queries till they get as granular as you need them to be. Where does row level filtering? And you can do complex logic here with multiple wheres. You can do ands, ors. Although it's case insensitive by default, you can make it case sensitive. If you're looking to select out just certain columns from the output, that's a little different in KQL. Instead of select, it's called project. And once again, you project and you get the code completion. Now you can do a lot of this stuff directly in the GUI, as you can see here. You can set the time range in code, or you can use the graphical control here. Down in the results, you can pare down the columns that you see just by using this column picker, as you can see. So you don't have to use code if you don't want to. The way the results come back, unless you specify a graphic, is a table. But notice that because some of the output may have a lot of columns, and no matter how big your monitor is, it may run out of space. There's this notion where you can expand and look at all of the columns vertically as well as horizontally. Okay, you can do on-the-fly grouping, and also if you're really into that kind of thing, you can take a look at the performance metrics for your queries. Because if you're an old SQL salt, you're probably interested in performance tuning, and there's a whole science really to performance tuning KQL queries. Now, as far as my best resources to help you get up to speed quickly with KQL, we can get to that right from in here, believe it or not. But I'm going to go to this interface in a different way. What do I mean by that? Microsoft makes available a free playground for you to use. It's free to use. You're using Microsoft sample data. It's authenticated. You have to sign in with your Azure AD account or your Microsoft account. Here's the URL, portal portal.loganalytics.io/demo. Once again, it's portal.loganalytics.io/demo. And when you come in there, you can verify I'm signed in with my Azure AD account. And we've got, I don't know how much sample data in there in the tables list, but there's a lot. And this is a nice sandbox environment to where, although Kusto is always just read-only, it's not like you're going to threaten any of your log data by whacking it, changing it, or deleting it. It's important to say we're just doing reporting here. It's nice to be able to do this on a huge data set in the convenience of the portal, as we can see. So anyway, to get back to my original point, check this out. Here's a nice bit of knowledge for you. If we go over here to Query Explorer, we have this list of pre-done queries. You might think, okay, fine. Yeah, there's covering, common virtual machine and networking tasks. That's fine. But look here, Pluralsight. What's this? And I swear this isn't promotion. Full disclosure, I am a Pluralsight staff author, but I would recommend this no matter who I worked for. A colleague of mine named Robert Kane has produced a couple courses for Pluralsight. You don't have to watch them. You don't have to have a subscription. But as you can see, the engineering team's a big fan of Robert's work and put his demo files right here in the Query Analytics Playground. And they're really quite useful indeed. We can just start to work on this one. I'm selecting Module 2. We can see that we can do line comments using the JavaScript or C# type of line comments. This allows you to document your code. And what Robert does here, we won't go through every single example, but it's a great quick start. If you're just looking to do a free search, you can just use the search command, as you can see here, like this command here. And Robert's demonstrating that KQL is not case sensitive by default. So perf pipe search memory, we would expect, is going to look across the entire perf table across all data sources, would be Windows virtual machines, and come back with data related to memory statistics, which we can see down below. How can we start to pare this down? Because in the real world, you probably have a question that you need answered. I need to know the VMs that, I don't know, that have a counter value of below a certain value or above a certain value. So you want to start to add on to these. How can we do that? Well, again, it's just a case of iterating a little bit with the language, where counter name, or not counter path, counter name is greater than, or it may be less if we're looking at available memory. And then we can see what's the counter value here. I'll say less than 5 or less than 4. Yeah, I'll say 4. And the way this works is that it's a multi-tab interface to where you can have multiple queries going in the same interface. Or you could put them in a single file, it doesn't matter. But if you do them in a single file, you want to select the lines that you want to run. Didn't like that. Maybe it didn't like the space. Or counter name. I'm a little bit clumsy here with this. Might be a data type issue that I'm running into, and we could do other stuff like, let me select those first 2 lines. We're just looking for a particular computer, where computer is JBox00. I'm pretty clumsy here, of course, but yeah, okay, fine. So going from there, right? And you can, as I mentioned earlier, there's some good docs articles, and you can get to those right here in this help menu, as far as looking at joins, multi-table joins, that kind of stuff. If you want to limit the results that come back, the order by, a lot of the SQL constructs are available here by default. Now let me come back to my workspace. So Query Explorer is pretty cool. I've created some saved queries because that's something else you can do with your query. Once you find a query that's particularly helpful to you, you can save it just in here. It gets stored as part of your user account, but there's nothing to stop you from sharing the query with your colleagues, of course. Some other things we can do, there's the share right here. We can export the results of a query, either all the columns or just the ones that you've filtered. And then here's an integration point between your query and Power BI. Now this can really get important when you have conditions that you need to take action on. For example, you might already be using alerts in Azure Monitor, for example, and you can create action groups that not only notify the appropriate parties, but also run code, maybe in an Azure Function app or an Azure Automation Runbook or whatever, Logic app, that kind of thing. Well, you should know, if you don't already know, that you can create alerts that are based on log queries. In fact, let me look in my saved queries. I've got one called shut down VMs. So what's this one doing? This says, go into the Azure Activity Virtual Table, where the time generated was in the last 10 minutes, and where the operation name is deallocate virtual machine and the activity status is succeeded. Azure Activity is the name of the virtual table that the activity log writes to. So this might cover the case that if a virtual machine that should never be shut down is down, use that logic to create the alert. That's what I'm trying to drive at here. Let me close this Query Explorer. So once you've got that query created, we can create a new alert rule and follow the traditional Azure Monitor alert rule pattern here. It's already scoped to whatever target level you were on. And then it's already plugged in the results of the query, and we can go back and tweak that if we want to. Notice that Azure gives us an estimated monthly cost, and then you would patch that into an action group that does a notification and or some kind of automated remediation.
And Mark, what are you doing?
Not too
Have
much. How are
finished
you?
your dinner?
Yeah, I
All of
did.
it?
I did. Yep. I'm all set. All right. Questions, comments, concerns as we're hitting the home stretch here?
And Sven's been responding to some of the questions, which we appreciate. Thanks a lot, Sven.
Thank you, Sven. Absolutely. This is one thing I love about the Microsoft community. People pitching in and helping. That is so, so cool. Grateful to be in this community. Well, let me give you a couple other heads up on good starter queries in Log Analytics. Over on the left-hand side, we were looking at the table structure. I mean, that's fine if you know in advance in general what you're looking at, but you can go to queries, and again, you can group this in a number of different ways. Maybe you could go by resource type and say, let's say, for example, we're looking again at virtual machines or storage accounts or SQL servers, and we can get a bunch of canned queries that Microsoft has created for us. These can be awfully helpful as a starting point. Another thing that I always like to call out, I think it might be the same list as this query list. Over on the toolbar, you can click queries, and it gives you another interface where you can group them by either solution or resource type. Let me see, look down for virtual machines. And what these are good for specifically is, my understanding is that Microsoft has populated these queries based on their customer support requests. So in the name of you not having to reinvent the proverbial wheel or search Stack Overflow for a long time to get closer to the query you need to work on, you may be able to start directly with one of these queries in here. Virtual machine available memory over time, for example. Now, this is a lot because it's bringing back a lot of servers. But what you can see here is summarizations. But look at this last line here, render time chart. You can dynamically generate charts and graphs of your log analytics queries, in addition to just the traditional tabular stuff that you can grab as a CSV. That's pretty compelling in terms of being able to just, I would use Snagit, not this particular diagram, but once I've pared it down sufficiently, just use Snagit or something to take a screen capture of it to put it in my report, So that I think is pretty cool. Okay. So at the end of the proverbial day, wrapping up here, what are we looking at here? You're getting up to speed with KQL, giving you a bunch of resources for free to get up to speed with the language, giving you a reference to Billy York and his blog that has all sorts of good learning on it. Ultimately, what we're looking at here is moving away from being reliant on old school stuff, looking up logs in storage account table or blob service, or even being less dependent on graphical solutions like an Azure Monitor, like I mentioned. You've got Metrics Explorer still. We've got those workbooks, which are cool, but you may find over time it's more efficient to use these queries, especially when you tie them into alert rules. Fun fact, there's also an enormous library of starter queries, for lack of a better term, in Azure Sentinel. So when you bring in your data sources into Azure Sentinel, you'll be right out of the box given a bunch of KQL to help you with threat hunting. So I really have to commend Microsoft for going above and beyond. It's great when they'll release a product that already is rich and rife in terms of samples, examples, explanations, and documentation. All right, Areno, Bill. I think that, let me go back to my deck and see if there's anything left in here that's, I do have a link in the slides, as you can see, to the Log Analytics Query Playground. Yep, I've got some additional further learning links here. The official docs are very good, online tutorials, and Pluralsight video training. Those are Robert Kane's courses specifically, if you do happen to have a trial or a subscription. KQL from scratch and advanced KQL. All right, well, would you agree with me that yesterday was the time to learn KQL? And if you are looking at certifying, I often say to my students, you know, say 50% of your effort in the portal, 30% in PowerShell, and then the remaining 20% between Azure CLI and KQL. It's not going anywhere. Similarly to how Project Bicep is not going anywhere with ARM template deployment. There's another link to the resources, timw.info/KQL2021, and there's my contact deets. Thanks so much. What else do you have for me? Or anybody want to share their insights, their own, what you've got to say or what you might have done with all this thus far? I am all ears.
Thanks a lot, Tim. If no, oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I just had a question. One of the difficult things I've had trouble with Log Analytics was trying to query using tags. I'm not sure if that's something that you know is supported, to like query across, say, a subscription and pull all resources with a tag.
I haven't crossed that bridge myself, but boy, you've really got me thinking. Sven's been answering a lot of questions in the chat. Sven, if you know, or if even you want to come on audio.
Okay, no fair, because I wasn't prepared for this, Tim.
Sorry about that. Sorry. No pressure. No pressure.
I do understand the conundrum. You may have to go and query the graph first to figure out, you know, which resources contain those tags, and then use those resource IDs to go query whatever logs, you know, maybe, I don't know, activity log or other things like that, you know, that you don't want to query. And it seems like Richard is agreeing with me on that, yeah. So
I think that's a brilliant idea, the resource graph. Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, and I'm just looking at a tech community article I just found where somebody else from Microsoft says there isn't a log table out of the box that can do the tags. So they're recommending iterating through your resources with like a runbook or a logic app.
Okay,
Might be faster to use the graph directly. You're welcome. Sure thing. Anybody else?
Just let me put in a plug for the playground. I've learned a lot using the playground. In fact, I also taught a log analytics course using the playground. So, and those queries that are canned are really, you know, educational.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, then I want to thank Tim for a great presentation again, as usual. And we'll try to post the recording the next few days so that if you missed it or if you know someone who missed it, they can see the recording. With that,
Now,
talk to you next
if
month.
I can figure out, Bill, how to stop my screen share,
It's okay.
I'm telling you,
No
Zoom
problem.
does some things sometimes that are just, to me, it's probably just keyboard and chair failure here, but I'm like, how do I stop my screen share? I'm
Okay, I'm gonna
literally
stop
at a
the-
loss.
I'm going to stop the recording anyway.